why is digital innovation such a big issue in modern defence?
So I think for me, one of the big things that we've got to look at is the fact the world's a very different and probably more volatile place than it was 3-4 years ago. I think if you look at some of the emerging and evolving threats, I think there's a need for the Western forces, UK, NATO, however we want to cut it, to be able to adapt and move quickly, and I think digitalisation has got a huge part to play in that.
And in terms of trying to understand some of those threats, it's not just the very front line, but it's the data science that goes behind it and what other forces are using. So the intelligence services and how we can support their response.
Absolutely. I think we've got a responsibility to look at the full procurement life cycle and how we as Deakin and others can utilise digitalisation to shorten that timeline in order to get the equipment into the front line. I think it's very difficult when you look at production methods for us to really have much impact in those, but I think there's a huge amount we can do around data analytics, governance optimisations, process optimisations to shorten that front end piece, which in turn will put the products into frontline forces quicker.
Absolutely.
How can we use digital or digitalisation and not digital optimisation to really look at improving that procurement life cycle? What are the sort of salient points we can put in to really make a difference?
I think one point for me is definitely contracting for the future, not only now. So I think it's looking at what we can expect from the emerging and evolving threats and how we can use digital innovation to effectively manage those for future state as well.
I think that's a really good point, because where we've been working on some of the contracts recently, we're setting up 10, 15-year contracts, some of them are longer, and the nature of the supply chain is going to evolve in that time, the product's going to evolve. So we need to be establishing contracts now that are permissive of change rather than locking everything right down, so that where our supply chain is working with the technical buyer, the technical solution will evolve, and we need the two sides, the two partners to work together under the single contract so that we can deliver the product quite quickly for them. And in setting that contract or forming the contract in the right way will enable a collaborative working environment rather than a partisan confrontational approach. And that collegiate way of working is going to help our buyers, our customers, deliver far more effectively.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Karl. I think what we've seen in the past is the contract will get signed in paper form, put in a drawer, and then probably forgotten about. And I think one of the key things that we've got with digitalisation of this is around the contract management piece as well. Because I think by having the dynamic KPIs, having the contract in digital format where it's easily accessible, all of those little, quite transactional steps will go together to make quite a big difference in how the actual contract is managed through its 10 to 15 year life cycle.
Yeah, we have seen a few examples in different industries where the corporate knowledge leaves with people. People are using personal email addresses for things, contract decisions are lost. So having a central repository is useful, and being able to access that from all different platforms. Millie, you were talking about the need to know?
Yeah, I think sort of tying on from that, it's almost the knowledge management and how we can make sure we're safe and secure, but how we can optimise our efficiencies and how we manage that information. And I think another thing is keeping the capability of the workforce. So with knowledge management, it's how can we ensure this knowledge that Karl was speaking about isn't lost to time? How can we ensure that the future workforce has the same capabilities that the old workforce has? And one way we can do that is digital innovation.
No, absolutely, and I think one of the key challenges that you've touched on, Emily, is around the training of the workforce, and I think there's a huge opportunity with digitalisation that we can look to streamline some of that, move the frontline training away from the products themselves, so you haven't got that risk of damage to an asset that's cost a lot of money to put in service. You're upskilling your workforce. It's easier from a security perspective because you can manage it much more easily. If it's digital access, you can have password control, you can have it offline or airlocked away from public access, so it's much easier to control that element of it. And I think it's a lot quicker as well because you can rinse and repeat that training program 4, 5, 6 times in a day versus having to reset up an entire workshop or an entire production line in order to train the staff.
I think on the need to know bit is you can have almost need to know register, or something where it's easy easily accessible as to who has access to that information and how we control that and how we lock that down.
So when we're looking at establishing new contracts, thinking of all of these areas of innovation, what would you be focusing on when you're thinking through advising the technical buyer what they need to be shaping in terms of managing knowledge, managing training, and managing obsolescence of products?
So I think for me, you've got to start looking at things in full product life cycle. I think you've got to be fully cognizant of how long something is going to be in service. Think about that when you're entering into your contracts. I think it's worth including in your contract schedules around how you're going to manage that knowledge transfer. We've already touched upon doing it sort of in a digital way so that you've got that sort of fingerprint or that will outlast individuals within the company. So you've always got that sort of corporate knowledge that becomes property of the company. And I think you've then got to look at how you can start modelling and using digitalisation to look at how you shape that product life cycle as well. So I think for me, you can look at things like digital twins and how you can put something into the sort of digital space, simulate what would happen to it over a number of years rather than having to do physical testing on it. And then you can then look at making optimisation to your production line without actually ever putting the thing in service. And I think that's where we're going to get a huge return on investment in terms of value for money.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Taking that just to a stage further, when we are writing these fairly comprehensive contracts that can be running for a long time, the people that form the contract on both sides probably won't be there for the life cycle of the contract. So we've been including explainers in contracts so that people understand the intent of the contract and what the purpose of it and how it's anticipated to operate. So if there becomes arguments later on, people can understand the intent of the contract and why clauses were included. So that very much planning the contracts now for long-term delivery and long-term management is quite a key factor for us in setting up the right buyer-provider partnerships.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to build on that, Karl, I think we can utilise KPIs in the digital space as well, because I think what the digital revolution offers us is the opportunity to have a lot more evidence-based decision making. And I think by tracking the KPIs digitally, you'll get a very clear view of how the supplier is performing, which will enable you to shape decisions down the governance chain probably quicker than you would without that, because you've got that full end-to-end knowledge piece that you can really draw on to make those decisions. And then I think there can be lessons learned that hopefully will speed up the process going forward in the future.
So, thinking about innovation, data, and using all different forms of technology, how does that really support our clients getting mission ready, and how does it help decision making in practice? That's what we're here to look at.
So I think one way we can start to look at that is how we can innovate in the back office and bring it all the way through to the front end, keeping like a holistic view of everything and approach, whilst being able to tailor it to specific functions in response to sort of the changing landscape.
Yeah, I think really good point, and I think what really helps with that is there's a huge amount of data out there now, so you can almost see the time taken for each of the individual steps on the process, and you can have that big picture, holistic view, and then really look at optimising each step, which will have quite a big impact at the end of the process. You might only save sort of 2-3 days here and there throughout, but all of those 2-3 days add up to really make quite a big difference in terms of getting the product into full service.
I think that's true in terms of getting new products into service, but also where we're working with some of our suppliers at the moment, looking at the R&D side of things, understanding the technical ask, so helping those people understand what's needed through the forming a contract for innovation, getting stuff then delivered on the back of that, which then will help products get to service. So all of that is relying on good data exchange, information exchange, all different levels of data, from what's being contracted, contract data, but then also the product data. So that can be then shared with multiple parties in formats that people understand and can use. Understanding the environment we're working in, levels of security that are needed with that, is all part of how we can use data differently or data better to get that information exchange through.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to echo what you said there, Karl. I think it's a really, really good point, and I think what the digitalisation really allows us to do is deeply drill into that as well. So you can really look at the trade spaces that you're making, be that commercial or programmatic, and really understand the impacts of those trades. So it might be that you're saving a little bit of money at the front end of the contract, but actually by modelling it through and seeing the impact that would have, it might be that it costs you money in the long term. So it will underpin decisions like that, and it will also help, I think, with some of the friction between programme and the need for speed, but also that need for value for money, cognizant of the fact that it's public purse that's being spent.
Yeah, I mean that understanding the metrics there, the value for money, social value, value for money, but whichever metric we want to use, I think if we can demonstrate that in the whole life cycle, that becomes super important.
I think tying into that as well, we can sort of look at our inter-territory relationships. So our friends across the pond, so to speak, sort of how do we communicate with them in an agile way? How can we get that communication quickly, succinctly? How can we all be on the same page? Even if we kind of use different metrics, for example, how can we make sure everything is kind of similar and we're working in alignment rather than against each other?
Well, look, I think really good point, and I think for me the key bit around that is the application of the technology. I think it's all well and good us talking about digitalisation as this sort of theory off to one side, but really the value from it is going to come by how we actually apply that to the decision making in practice, and how do we really leverage the benefits from it. So it's really how do you incorporate that tech into business as usual essentially and make it part of your decision making process, but it's how we then have that human element to sense check it, if you will. So I think it's great that we can automate a lot of this stuff, and there's huge value in that, but I think that the problem statement is then where do we have that human intervention to really make sure that it's on the straight and narrow?
Absolutely. There is lots of discussion around AI, and we're not necessarily saying hand it all over to the machines, have artificial intelligence making all the decisions, but if we can process data effectively and understand the repetitive, the process automation we can introduce, that becomes really valuable. Then on the back of that, what are the decision points where it needs the human intervention, the understanding of what we're actually trying to deliver. That becomes an area that we can look at. We do lots of business process mapping. So as we understand the processes, we can understand what can be automated, and through that automation, where can we get the best value from the people that are around the network, whether it's single territory or multiple territory. Those decision points become a lot clearer.
I think on that as well, speaking about sort of human factors of it and the values that human adds as well, I think building those relationships, you can't rely on computers to necessarily build relationships with partners, suppliers, whoever it may be, but you can use computers and digital innovation to facilitate those relationships. Instead of sending a letter that will take a week to reach someone, you can ping them an email and it'll take 5 minutes. And I think using that to kind of have those conversations and build those relationships and good working relationships is key to facilitating timelines and product delivery.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and I think we've got to look at it as a tool in the toolbox. There's other tools that are out there. This is one. I think it's a really powerful one used properly. But I think that the real key point is empowering the decision makers with the right information, the right data, the right analytics to enable them to make more accurate, better decisions. Yeah. And I think that's where, if we can nail that, that's going to really be where digitalisation can add massive value into the defence industry.
So digital innovation presents loads of challenges and opportunities that we can exploit for the betterment of our clients. So thinking about ways of working in commercial management and how that could change, what do you think we should be focusing on?
I think one of the things that we can look at is translating technical needs to commercial outcomes and adding value there. So one of the ways you could look at that is how we can use digitisation to create visuals and visualisation of data, and how that can then lead to informed decision making.
Yeah, I think a really good point, really. I think one of the challenges that we often see is there's almost a different language spoken by technical teams versus commercial teams. They're almost focusing on different outcomes, and I think digitalisation gives us an opportunity to break some of those barriers down, because I think you can really very clearly and visually see the impact of a change to scope or tweaking the scope or changing some of the commercial conditions and what that would mean in terms of your milestones, in terms of your actual product delivery. So I think it gives a really good platform to enable those conversations to happen on a slightly different level to maybe where they've been happening so far.
Yeah, I think in the construction sector, bringing ideas across from different industries, there's been fly-throughs of buildings by architects to help the users of the building understand what it's going to actually be like. And if we can take that principle and apply it to some of the defence sector contracts, so people can see what the product is and what the components are, and they can start to see that being timelined across it, whether it's major platforms that are being created or whether it's just elements, that the visualization, and we can overlay then the cost data to the timeline, it makes it far more real for people to buy into what the problem is.
Absolutely. No, and I think it's a really great point. I think you never really realise a problem until you try and do it in anger, and then suddenly you're like, oh, I wish I'd designed this differently, or I wish I'd tweaked this, or you see examples where buildings are designed and the product itself can't fit in it because no one's thought about the turning circle of the thing moving in once you get it through the doors, So real life problems, and I think we've really got an opportunity with digitalisation and the modelling to really run those simulations to understand exactly how the thing will work in anger before you actually spend the money, time, effort, everything else constructing it. Hopefully iron those problems out up front. And what about the contracts themselves, Karl? I mean, what's your view on how we can look at contracting differently now we've got sort of digitalisation coming on?
So I think that's really the heart of what we're trying to do. Some of the more traditional forms of contract can be quite adversarial, and they're really not shaped around enabling long-term relationships or innovation, and they're not really shaped around the outcomes that we need. And we've come across this time and again on various things that we've set up. So having bespoke contracts has some advantages, some disadvantages. Having them framed against a standard set of contracts can often be a good starting point. But the uniqueness of what we're seeing in the defence sector really is calling for bespoke-based contracts, and building into there the right metrics, the right ways of working, particularly the ways of working, will help the innovation. And in there, we can then be shaping them around what the outcomes are that we need to deliver, but also then shaping them around how risk is being managed. So one of our focus we've been discussing recently is having a proportionate allocation of risk. So if we can model that, pretty much the modelling as we were talking previously, we can model where the risk is most likely to fall and how we can manage that risk. And then as we start to enter the areas of the program or product that we don't fully yet know, but the contract is to enable those to be developed, we can start to model where that risk should sit. Should it rest with the technical buyer, or should it rest with the supply chain? And if we can get that right, we can reduce the overall cost of the contract. So the modelling and using the right analytics there, creating digital twins, becomes really a key to getting the right form of contract. We can bring new players to market, particularly the small and medium-sized enterprises. If we can drive some cross-industry collaboration, we get specialist or niche players, either to come under larger contractors or direct to the technical buyer, by right-sizing contracts and right-sizing risk, so the risk is tolerable both to the buyer and to the supplier. And we can reduce then the barriers to entry by helping them understand what they need to be delivering, what risk they are potentially taking on, because a lot of these enterprises don't have the capacity to carry significant risk. So looking at how we contract differently will enable different suppliers to enter the market.
I think bang on, and I think the other real benefit that I see in this space is, and just building on what you said around the barriers to entry, I think one of the challenges defence have had is in the past is it's hard for those small medium enterprises who really deliver the innovation in other sectors to get in. If you look at a production line, you need a huge amount of floor space, you probably need a classified workshop or security capable workshop, you need security cleared staff, you need maybe quite large numbers obviously because you're lone working, all those rules around things that you'd have to abide by, whereas if we can take a lot of that into the cyberspace and digitalise a lot of it, it allows them to really model those production lines rather than create them, and that makes it a lot easier in terms of you can do it out of a much smaller office, you can do it remotely, you need a way fewer number of people cleared, to operate in that space, and you can really then tap into those small niche companies that really drive innovation in that space, which has been inaccessible for the defence sector prior. So I think there's huge value in looking at how we can contract better with those small, medium enterprises to enable them to do what they do best for the benefit of the defence sector.
So, with digital innovation, what does good look like?
I think starting to understand what good looks like comes from learning from experience. I think it's understanding where we were, what we did well and what we didn't do well, and how we can adapt that for future learning and improvements, really.
Yeah, absolutely bang on. And I think for me, at the moment we're talking about this like it's really innovative, brand new, cutting edge stuff. And I think, we'll know that we've hit the stage of good once it's fully embedded as business as usual for people. It's underpinning the decisions at governance boards. It's underpinning those budgetary decisions of where money's spent. The evidence from the contracts and KPIs is all tracked digitally, so that you've got that clear supplier performance analysis that allows you to make decisions around renewals of contracts, extensions, or whether you look to recompete or retender. And I think it's also really getting the commercial and the programmatic technical folk working together a lot better as well. And I think it gives us a really good opportunity to clarify the language used by both and understand the impacts of decisions at either end of that process on the overall holistic picture. So I think for me, good is really, like I say, having it fully embedded and not something we talk about as innovative. It just becomes the norm, something that is always used, and it'll be alien not to have it. And I think once we hit that phase, we know we've probably got to good.
Yeah.
And what about yourself, Karl? Anything from your view?
So for me, it's about people and processes. It's not just a machine that is going to do things for us, and it's also about having the application in mind first, what the outcome is, and then delivering the technology to deliver that outcome.
So this is the first of many conversations we're going to be having in the defence space, and we're really interested to hear everyone else's thoughts on the challenges, the opportunities and difficulties especially, and how we can combat those.